Good morning, everyone. My name is Kevin Lanoue. I'm the Associate Director of Integrative Services here at Sierra Tucson and an organic intelligence practitioner. Today's presentation here, The Organizing Music of Nature, will run about 25 minutes and we'll save a little time at the end for some questions. There are handouts to download if you're interested in that. Before we get started here, I just want to invite you all to enjoy this little bit of time together in whatever way feels good. So if it feels good to pay attention and then to not pay attention for a little bit, to listen and to not listen, to stand up and move around a little bit and come back to the seated position, please follow your impulse towards ease and comfort here. I'll pause the camera as I go through the presentation, and I'll come back onto the camera here for questions in a little bit. Good. So beginning here with the concept of biophilia, I'll read a little bit from these slides and sometimes not so much, so it's not just reading the entire time here, but this was a term coined by the biologist E.O. Wilson, referring to the notion that humans have a natural sense of biophilia. This is an innate love for the landscapes in which humans have lived for most of our existence, and for the web of life that surrounds us. And also worth noting that almost all animals get distressed if they are deprived of the kinds of landscape that they evolved to live in. This next quote here is from Howard Frumkin from a seminal paper of 2001. He says, according to E.O. Wilson's biophilia hypothesis, humans are innately attracted to other living organisms. And later authors have expanded this concept to suggest that humans have an innate bond with nature more generally. This implies that certain kinds of contact with the natural world may benefit health. And one of the reasons I included this quote is you can see the name of this paper here from 2001, Toxicity, Human Health in the Natural Environment. Up until this point, a lot of what sort of science there was looking into the relationship between humans and the natural world focused on things that were harmful, so toxicity, pollutants, environmental hazards. And for the last, let's say, 5-10 years, studies have turned very much towards the benefits of our interaction with nature. So we'll talk a bit more about that today. A little timeline here where we came from, right? We've been vertebrate for approximately 500 million years, mammals for 250 to 300 million years, primates now for approximately 65 million years. Noting this to note here that our physiology, including our nervous systems, evolved as we moved around in the natural world in relation with natural cycles, including those related to light and dark, right, circadian rhythms, temperature variation, various threats and sources of autonomic activation, seasonal relationships with plants and animals and places, and a variety of social connections. Our nervous systems, in fact, are built to resonate with set points derived from the natural world. Now here are some of the, what are still to me startling statistics. I don't know, maybe we're becoming inured to this kind of information, but here's a little bit on how much time we are connected to technology. Average American spends 4.5 days looking at TV screens, and you can see here all the more time on computer screens, gaming devices, 4.5 hours looking at a smartphone. I recently heard 70% of people sleep with their smartphones. We check our phones 1,500 times a week. According to the EPA, the average American currently spends 93% of their life indoors, which includes a little time in your car. So that's about half a day a week outdoors. I wonder if one day these statistics will seem somehow quaint, right? Like maybe one day there were people who were saying, you know, these automobiles now, people are in their cars for a couple hours a day. Startling. Here we are now recognizing too that children in America and Britain spend half as much time outdoors as their parents did. And in 2008, the World Health Organization noted that for the first time, more people live in urban areas than rural ones. That's when we officially became an urban species. So we're in the midst of the largest mass migration in modern times, humans shifting to cities, and yet there maybe hasn't been so much planning around how to make those cities suit our psychological needs. So here's a conundrum. Studies have shown, and we'll look at some of these in a minute here, that nature makes us healthier, more creative, more empathetic, and more apt to engage with the world and with each other. And yet we are prone to forecasting errors. So that is making bad predictions about how we choose to spend our time. And it's been postulated here that people may avoid nearby nature because a chronic disconnection from nature causes them to underestimate its benefits. There was a specific study done around that with college students predicting how they would feel walking through tunnels across campus versus walking outdoors. And they consistently overestimated how good it would feel to walk through the tunnels and consistently underestimated how good it would feel to walk outdoors. When some metrics around happiness and stress reduction were measured afterwards. Here are a few studies that touch on some aspects of this. People who moved from a green rural area to a city experienced a substantial increase in depression, and people who moved from a city to a green rural area experienced a substantial reduction in depression. Another study here with people in cities who took a walk in nature and it improved their mood and ability to concentrate. And for people who had been depressed, the improvement was 5 times greater than the improvement for other people. Considering whether that could just be related to the movement, and the studies have shown that it's not only the exercise. For example, a study showed that people who run on a treadmill in a gym and people who run in nature both saw a reduction in depression, but was higher for the people who run in nature. We'll turn to some of the research that's come out of Japan around forest bathing, thing that's been studied rigorously there for maybe 5 years or so now, looking into the beneficial effects of nature. And in part so that this information could be delivered to policymakers and the medical establishment. So questions include, why is nature so effective at alleviating so many things that ail us? Who is best helped? By what mechanisms in the brain and body? What's the best dose of nature? We'll talk about that in a moment. And even what qualifies as nature. So there are a couple dominant theories that have emerged as to why our brains need nature, and the research is driven along these two lines extensively. The first is research quantifying how nature lowers stress and boosts mental health, using a framework based on the biophilia hypothesis, right? The idea that we feel most at home in nature because we evolved there. And the second branch of research, much of which goes on here in the US, is around how nature restores our attention-addled brains to a state of sharper cognition. So those studies involve tests on how folks, it's around attention. So we live in an attention economy. Our attention is being engaged constantly. Measures of attention, cognition and creativity and other things. And this line of research talks about how when the default mode network in the brain is engaged, that the executive network, which includes the prefrontal cortex and all of our reasoning and logic and planning, is not engaged. So this line of research is around how engaging the default mode network allows our executive network to rest, which is something that it needs. To gauge people's physiological response to natural and urban environments, researchers looked at changes in things like blood pressure, pulse rate, variable heart rate, salivary cortisol, hemoglobin in the brain's prefrontal cortex, and this gives a picture of the autonomic nervous system of parasympathetic and sympathetic states. And we know from a long line of research going back to the 30s that people who produce chronically high cortisol levels and high blood pressure are more prone to heart disease, metabolic disease, dementia, and depression. So studies have shown that nature, time in nature, and even images of nature as compared to images of urban environments support physical stress recovery. Here's a little bit about that, what might be the best dose. So I noted an article here at the top that was just in February here from the Wall Street Journal. The headline is, "For Better Health During the Pandemic, Is 2 Hours Outdoors the New 10,000 Steps?" And if you go query for this article, you'll see that these a lot of articles with similar headlines about this 2-hour metric, they go back to a few years here. This study, 2019, this study published in Nature Scientific Reports. So their conclusion was that spending at least 120 minutes a week in nature is associated with good health and well-being. And that there was a point under 2 hours did not make a difference, and that going up to 3 or 4 hours, there was a peak. Beyond that did not make measurable differences. I want to pause here and note that personally, I reckon while 2 hours is good, more hours is better too. And further studies showed actually that 2 hours could be broken up into increments, so it didn't even require 2 hours all at once. And here's a little bit about this forest bathing. So in Japan and now in South Korea too, there are programs in universities studying this, folks being certified as practitioners, medical providers writing prescriptions for forest bathing, and land being dedicated for this use. So one hallmark of forest bathing is 5 sense engagement. So in connecting to the environment through the senses, through all 5 senses, and they measured marked improvements in mood and stress levels. Furthermore, nature's effects on mood states and stress are manifest in the human immune system. Specifically, some research here done around natural killer immune cells, NK cells, which protect us from disease and can be reliably measured in labs and send signals to disease agents and even cancer cells to self-destruct. And so these NK cells are super helpful for us. And they've shown that stress and aging and pesticides can reduce NK cell counts, at least temporarily. And so this researcher, the immunologist here in the environmental medicine department at Nippon Medical School in Tokyo, wondered if nature reduces stress, can it also increase NK cells and help fight infections and cancer? And the answer is yes. So an initial study demonstrated that hiking in the forest 3 mornings in a row increased NK count by 40%. And that boost lasted for 7 days. And a month later, those NK cell counts were still 15% higher in folks than when they started, before they did the hike, the 3 days of hiking. Further studies then showed that urban walking trips of the same duration, there was no change in NK levels. And then further studies demonstrated that even an hour-long walk in a city park had the same effect in increasing NK cell count, though it didn't last as long. And then some of this research turned to why that might be, what the impact is, nature environment versus like urban environment, and started looking at the trees. And the question was whether maybe these NK cells were boosted by the chemical compounds emitted by these plants, so terpenes, pinene, other essential oils that are emitted by evergreen trees and others in these forests in Japan. And scientists there identified over 100 such substances in the in the air over these Japanese forests, and none in city air, unless it was directly over a park. And further studies showed that even using cypress oil in a diffuser increased NK cells by 20%. That study was done with two groups of people that were they were sequestered in hotel rooms for a couple weeks, and one group got cypress oil through a diffuser and the other group did not, got probably water through a diffuser. And the folks with the cypress oil saw the NK cell count increase 20%. No, I don't think the hotel room has anything to do with it, but maybe. Okay, turning now to another potential aspect of this, I want to talk for just a moment about fractals. So these are natural objects that show a self-replicating aspect, so this repeating patterns at different scales. And these fractals were discovered by Benoit Mandelbrot at Harvard. He coined this term in 1975. He found fractals through his exploration in mathematics. And although that's how he found them, he then started doing further research and recognized that these are actually a phenomenon that occurs in nature. So they're first and foremost a natural phenomena. And he, down at the bottom corner of this slide here, to understand fractal patterns at different scales, you can picture a trunk of a tree and a branch. And they might contain the same angles as that same branch and a smaller branch, and then the veins on the leaf and so on. And that's kind of a perfect end to that sentence about fractals that says, and so on. And I have some images of fractals to share with you here too. There are the chambers of a little shell here that shows fractal patterns. And the results of many studies show that exposure to fractal patterns in nature reduces people's levels of stress up to 60%. Here's some more images of fractals. You see ice crystals forming at the top, and here in a tree, and the branches of the tree to smaller branches, and these recurring patterns at different scales. And if you download the handouts that accompany this presentation, there is a single sheet handout in there from an organic intelligence course called The End of Trauma that has a little exercise that we do in that. It's called a Fractal Safari. It's an invitation to go out and actually look for and notice some of these fractal patterns that might be in your environment. And we take pictures of them and share them. And yeah, if any of you are interested in doing that and care to share the pictures, even by email, I love seeing them. So invitation there. One more fractal pattern here, and perhaps a little something about how it might work. So your visual system is in some ways hardwired to understand fractals. So the stress reduction is triggered by a physiological resonance that occurs when the fractal structure of the eye matches that of the fractal image being viewed. You can experience this and feel this with scenes that are too complicated versus those that can be taken easily in. It makes sense that our visual cortex would feel most at home among the most common natural features we evolved alongside. So perhaps part of our comfort in nature derives from fluent visual processing. Some fascinating studies were done around this impact of fractals and how this works and how prevalent they are. Maybe we'll talk more about them sometime, but if you're interested in that, it's a pretty cool thing to look into. So one more note about where we are now. So orientation, as we define it, is connecting to the environment through the senses. That means it can be done through all of the senses. We talked a little bit about smell and visual orientation and the implications of fractals and how they resonate in our system, and a little bit potentially about how that default mode network which is sort of the daydreaming, wandering. It's the biggest network in our brains. How easy engagement with default mode network then can support the rest for the executive network part of our brain. And forest bathing has a very specific kind of protocol around orientation, connecting to the environment through all 5 senses. They, for example, might make tea from local plants, so accessing through taste that way, and the other senses engaged out on a walk in the forest. So perhaps there's a way of considering our time in nature even as less about looking at things and more about this undirected attention. When perception is happening and there's a little less of the doing piece, and maybe we experience some of the influence of the fractals too. And in this undivided attention and connection through the senses, perhaps even there is an autobiographical piece, right? The piece that is, I am as much that as this, our relationship with nature. So what we call nature or wilderness, we might call home, we might call it wisdom, and we might notice how good that feels. I think it's also important to note here the shortcomings in this presentation and in these studies and stuff, the inherent sort of ableism that there is there when we say, you know, go take a walk or go run around or go look at this thing, that not all bodies have the same access to these various experiences, and so I'm naming that, recognizing that that's a deficit in how we talk about this, and not all folks have access to nature equally. So there's some built-in assumptions here that I'd like to name and yeah, like to dismantle in myself and find ways that we can support all bodies to experience the benefits of nature as we're describing it here. Finally, this is a poem from Rainer Maria Rilke. I think resonates a little bit with what we've been talking about here. Feel free to read it yourself. I'll read it here right quick. Ah, not to be cut off, not through the slightest partition shut out from the law of the stars. The inner, what is it, if not intensified sky, hurled through with birds and deep with the winds of homecoming. Thank you all for attending in whatever shape that was for you. We'll open up to some questions here now. I'll come back on the screen in a moment. I've included a list of references here, the Organic Intelligence website and courses, the book The Nature Fix by Florence Williams, from which much of this presentation draws on, fascinating stuff there. And the book by Johann Hari, Lost Connections, which also delves into our relationship with nature as one of the aspects for supporting recovery from depression, and some stuff on fractals there too. Good. I'll open it up now to questions or comments. Scrolling through the questions here for just a moment. Thank you. Oh, so there's a question, what is forest bathing? Perhaps so I'll reference you for one thing to that book, The Nature Fix. Broadly speaking, it is spending time in nature. The Japanese coined a term for this and really sort of launched a movement around forest bathing, which is, in short, getting out into the forest. But they do have some pretty specific approaches to sensory engagement and the amount of time. And South Korea now is really doing a whole lot of this work too. So it's being studied rigorously in those countries, prescribed for people, and land is being dedicated for this use, specifically for this use. A great question here. Any research on desert bathing? I would just say that yes, I conduct that research extensively, routinely myself, and it is very restorative, especially when we have a little water in the canyons here and there can actually literally be some desert bathing. Quite pleasurable. Yeah, why would forest bathing be more discussed than say seaside? Uh, Great question. Let's do some seaside bathing research too. I think forest bathing took off in Japan, and that's what they've been doing. But obviously, the healthful benefits of time in nature at the sea surely are prevalent, and I'd love to see some research done into that. Studies that tell us specific times that are best. So this 2-hour framework has gained a lot of traction. So that seems to be some kind of magic point, 2 hours. And there are studies that show that 2 hours can be broken up. It needn't be 2 hours consecutive, but doses of it. So that's there's quite a bit of information around that 2-hour mark. And of course, I'm hesitant to limit anyone to 2 hours. I think the more time, the better. Any research on therapy in nature? Not that I've come across. I'm interested in that topic very much. In organic intelligence practice, we often do what we call a walk and talk. So we do some nervous system based trauma work while walking in nature, and it's super helpful. So thank you so much for these questions. They're really great. I'd love to continue the conversation with any of you who are interested. My email is on the slide here and will be sent out in the thank you letter. So thank you all for attending. Thanks so much. Till next time.